And thank you for joining today's Education and Labor Committee briefing entitled Empty Promises, Comparing the President's Executive Actions to the HEROES Act. And this is a public-facing briefing that will be live streamed on the committee's YouTube channel. And I note that we invited our minority party colleagues to the briefing, but they have declined to participate. Nevertheless, the briefing is open to all committee members, and we continue to invite all of our colleagues to participate. Now, this is technically not an official committee activity, so there is no official record for this event. However, any member who wishes to share a relevant statement, article, letter, or other item may do so via their personal office's communications methods. Members must keep their microphones muted unless they are speaking, at which time you'll need to turn your video cameras and microphones on. For any members using a telephone and audio only, *6 will work to unmute and remute your phones. That's *6 to mute and remute. If anyone is experiencing problems connecting during the briefing, please contact the committee's IT director or committee chief clerk by email or phone. Their addresses, email addresses, and phone numbers are sent with the notice of the briefing. The clerk will now conduct a roll call to get a sense of who's on the call. Members, please unmute yourself so that you can respond to the roll call. Jerry?
Chairman Scott,
Present.
Mrs. Davis, Mr. Grijalva, Mr. Courtney, Ms. Fudge, Mr. Sablon,
Here.
Ms. Wilson, Ms. Bonamici, Mr. Takano, Ms. Adams,
Here.
Mr. Desaulnier, Mr. Norcross, Ms. Jayapal, Mr. Morelli, Ms. Wild,
Present.
Mr. Harder, Mrs. McBath, Ms. Schreier, Ms. Underwood, Mrs. Hayes, Ms. Shalala,
Present.
Mr. Levin, Ms. Omar, Mr. Trone, Mrs. Lee, Mrs. Trahan, Mr. Castro, Mrs. Fox, Mr. Rowe, Mr. Thompson, Mr. Wahlberg, Mr. Guthrie, Mr. Byrne, Mr. Grothman, Ms. Stefanik, Mr. Allen, Mr. Smucker, Mr. Banks, Mr. Walker, Mr. Comer, Mr. Klein, Mr. Fulcher, Mr. Wright, Mr. Muser, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Keller, Mr. Murphy, Mr. Van Drew. Chairman Scott, this concludes the roll call.
We
This is
have,
Kim
Ms.
Schreier. Hi,
Davis.
this is
Susan Davis
Mrs. Davis. Thank you.
and
Kim Schreier.
Kim Schreier.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Well, thank you. In a moment, we're going to hear from our distinguished guests, and after the experts finish their presentations, I'll open the floor for members to ask questions. Insofar as this is an informal briefing, members will be recognized in order in which they seek recognition and not in order of seniority. So please indicate if you have a question in the chat box. For those using a telephone on audio only, please have your staff indicate your interest in the chat box on your behalf. Today's briefing is scheduled to last 1 hour, so members should ask their questions succinctly and be considerate of other members waiting to ask questions. A chime will sound. We also have the timer, so maybe we won't have the chime. If people will be cognizant of the timer that's on the screen. If you you can pin that video to make sure that it ends up high on the screen so it won't get lost. That would be helpful. I now recognize myself for opening comments. 6 months after the country suffered its first COVID-19 related death, we're still experiencing an average of more than 50,000 new cases a day, facing the consequences of a pandemic. The public health risk of preventing K through 12 schools and institutions of higher learning from opening safety. For 21 straight weeks, the new weekly unemployment insurance claims have exceeded the worst previous records in history. And obviously millions of student loan borrowers are unemployed. Last week, the president took executive actions on student loans and unemployment insurance that purported to support student loans and workers. However, these actions failed to deliver the comprehensive support the House Democrats passed through the HEROES Act 3 months ago. For student borrowers, the president's action extends the pause on interest and payments, but for only 3 months compared to 12 additional months outlined in the HEROES Act. And the president's order also only applies to federal student loans held by the Department of Education, excluding more than 8 million borrowers. So a fifth of those covered under the HEROES Act are excluded from the president's executive order. Furthermore, the executive action does not suspend involuntary collections on federal student loans, exposing borrowers to garnishments in the middle of a pandemic and an unemployment crisis. More importantly, the executive action fails to support K through 12, fully support K through 12. It does nothing, for example, to help state and local governments avoid deep cuts to public education funding. The estimates of those cuts have been pegged at over $200 billion, maybe $300 billion or more. It does nothing to help schools open safely. It does not help colleges and universities avoid widespread layoffs. It does not save our child care system from collapse. The administration also issued an executive order regarding unemployment benefits, but instead of helping workers, the order would exclude from receiving benefits and would exclude many from receiving benefits, and also take far too long to implement for all for inadequate benefits that may last only a couple of weeks. Specifically, the order provides unemployment workers only $300 a week on top of the benefits received from anemic state unemployment systems. Shockingly, the administration would pay for the assistance by redirecting money from FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund during a season known for national disasters, such as windstorms that just struck Iowa. This would only further strain the budgets of cash-strapped states seeking to provide workers with additional support. In comparison, the HEROES Act maintains a $600 a week federal pandemic unemployment compensation and allows access to that relief through January 2021. The fact is that this administration and the Senate Republicans could have worked with the House months ago to extend these benefits, but instead, crucial benefits that held up the economy and fed and sheltered our constituents were left to expire. We also heard false claims that these benefits disincentivized people from working. But as the National Bureau of Economic Research concluded, allowing the additional $600 in payment to expire will lower local spending by roughly 44%. And several studies have debunked the idea that job openings are going unfilled because of the $600. We can and must do better for our constituents. That's why we're joined today by Ben Miller and Devita Gupta, who will compare the administration's recent executive actions to the real support offered in the HEROES Act. Ben Miller is Vice President for Post-Secondary Education at the Center for American Progress. He was previously the Research Director for Higher Education at New America, as well as Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development at the U.S. Department of Education. And Devita Gupta is the co-executive director of Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequity, where he leads work to develop and advance ideas for reducing domestic poverty and economic inequality with particular attention to gender and racial equity. He also serves on the National Academy of Social Insurance's Board of Directors and is a member of the Institute of Research Poverty, Employment, and Self-Sufficiency Network. I thank you both for being with us today, and we'll turn it over to Mr. Miller and Mr. Gupta, who will say a few words, starting with Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Chairman Scott and members of the committee for having me here today. Three major crises currently threaten our nation's education system. First, massive declines in state and local tax revenue will lead to substantial cuts to education, with likely disproportionate effects on public higher education. Second, even before cuts kick in, childcare centers, schools, and colleges are facing massive losses for having to move online, operate at reduced capacity, or close entirely. These losses especially threaten the viability of private childcare and post-secondary providers. Third, around 26 million student loan borrowers are expected to go back into repayment at the start of October in a dreadful economy where jobs are scarce and younger people appear to be particularly hard hit. President Trump's executive order on student loans did nothing on these first two issues, and time is running out for Congress to address them before calamity ensues. On the student loan issue, the executive order is at best an insufficient step that still leaves millions of borrowers in the lurch, lacks meaningful details, and could be bad for teachers, social workers, and others engaged in public service. To give you a sense of the scale of need on the education funding issues, CAP, along with 55 groups, sent a letter calling for $300 billion in additional education funding. This includes $50 billion for our nation's childcare system to help avert the potential loss of nearly 4.5 million childcare spots, half the national capacity. $200 billion for K-12 education, including things such as targeted supports for vulnerable students, covering the cost of converting classrooms to be safe to operate in, and the added expense of shifting online. And at least $50 billion for public higher education, plus more for private colleges, particularly minority-serving institutions. This will help avoid tuition hikes, which tend to be particularly bad during recessions because states disproportionately cut higher education. It will also help avert layoffs or reductions in academic quality and provide emergency grant aid to students. Funding public colleges is also a protection against exploitation by predatory colleges, which in past recessions have used capacity constraints in the public sector to recruit students into low-quality, overpriced programs. Education aid must come on top of support for state and local governments. If Congress only provides education funding, states will enact massive cuts that are even larger than the additional federal funding for schools. That brings us to the issue of student loan borrowers. Currently, all the provisions put in place by the CARES Act are set to expire at the end of September. That includes no required payments, no interest accumulation, no debt collection, and borrowers can still make progress toward loan forgiveness under an income-driven repayment plan or public service loan forgiveness. The executive order still lacks key details and fails to address some issues Congress was not able to get to in the CARES Act. Just as a quick rundown, the executive order claims to pause all payments on federal loans held by the Department of Education from October 1st through the end of the year. Borrowers also wouldn't be charged interest during this time, and payments would count toward the 20 or 25-year forgiveness clock for borrowers who are on payment plans tied to their income. This is insufficient. First, it leaves behind roughly 8 million borrowers who don't have federal loans held by the Department of Education. This includes those with older federal loans from private banks and Perkins loans held by colleges. Second, the pause only goes until the end of the year. There's little chance the economy will be in strong shape by then, and having roughly 26 million borrowers all enter repayment during the holidays is an implementation disaster in the making. An approach that pauses payments for a full year and ties interest restarting to positive economic indicators would be much better. Third, this proposal still lacks key details. As currently written, the executive order would not allow borrowers seeking public service loan forgiveness to have their payments count toward forgiveness while taking advantage of the pause. We don't know if borrowers will have to opt into the pause or have it be automatic. Requiring an opt-in could cause millions of borrowers to slip through the cracks and end up going delinquent. Fourth, the executive order is silent on the issue of student loan debt collection. This is also paused by CARES and affects millions of individuals who are much more likely to be low income or students of color. Now is not the time to start taking parts of borrowers' paychecks. Finally, the executive order does nothing on canceling student loans. Canceling even just $10,000 for borrowers could be transformative. Most borrowers in default took out about that much, meaning we could wipe out huge chunks of those in default who are having their lives ruined by these debts. It would get rid of about a third of the typical debt balance for a recent college graduate with loans, particularly important as we know younger individuals need time to get on their feet in the workforce. All this adds up to an executive order that's a distraction. It cannot and must not replace congressional action. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you. Mr. Duda Gupta.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, and members of the committee and the Committee of Education and Labor staff for organizing and hosting the briefing. And thanks also to my colleagues, GCPI, for helping with preparation of my remarks. The country's unemployment crisis is clearly still much worse than it ever was during the 2007 through 2009 financial crisis, despite the additional job gains we've seen. Many business closures and layoffs that seem temporary at first are quite clearly going to be permanent. With that in mind, I'm just going to make 4 key points. First, that a well-functioning unemployment assistance system supports racial justice. Second, that President Trump's recent executive order is too little, too complicated, and even for him, too illegal to be considered a serious plan for meeting the needs of unemployed families. This third point is that the $600 weekly boost to unemployment assistance helped millions meet a basic standard of living and was helping keep the economy afloat. And then fourth, Congress and the White House need to work to control the virus and enact substantial, sustained, and structural policies that ensure widely shared prosperity. So first, a well-functioning unemployment assistance system supports racial justice in part by protecting workers from the risk of unemployment and also by helping improve job preparation and job match quality. The benefits of a system like this are particularly meaningful for low-paid Black workers and other workers of color who are far more likely to experience job loss and are among the last to be rehired when they get laid off, and are far less likely to have adequate wealth or liquid assets to help weather such losses than are white workers. And even outside periods of elevated unemployment, we know unemployment assistance programs are particularly vital for women of color who typically experience much lower earnings, higher rates of poverty, and are more likely to raise children on their own than are men, in part due to structural racism and sexism in our economy. Well, let's get to the president's executive order, which is too little, it's too complicated, and too illegal to be considered a serious plan for meeting the needs of unemployed families. So at best, it provides grossly insufficient aid for an insufficient amount of time. We're talking about $44 billion versus the 300 to 350 plus billion really that was likely under the HEROES Act. And there are already estimates that more than 1 million Americans who receive unemployment benefits would be excluded from the president's executive order for a $300 weekly benefit boost, which is really a $300 cut compared to the $600. And that's in part because they've chosen to exclude some of the lowest paid workers in some of the stingiest states. So we're talking about a $1,300 a month income cut, even if you do get the benefit. The $44 billion is not expected to last more than 6 weeks. If every worker who is eligible starting August, which is how the executive order is written and being implemented, receives the benefit. But the order isn't just too little, it's also too complicated. It imposes new financial and technical burdens on already struggling states. I mean, for example, you've got states who are facing a $555 billion total shortfall, struggling to make payments to this day for regular unemployment benefits and pandemic unemployment assistance, and now they're being asked to stand up a whole new program. Finally, I think this program is quite transparently unlawful, violating multiple laws in multiple ways. But let's get to the point about the $600 weekly benefit boost, helping millions meet a basic standard of living and helping keep the economy afloat. We know that it likely has prevented widespread hunger, utility cutoffs, evictions, and even death. It helped keep poverty from rising, and it has supported so many of those out of work due to the COVID-19 crisis, as well as likely helped power the economic recovery during the pandemic. We have 5 studies that I can get into in more detail later that confirm that there was absolutely no negative effect on employment. So now we can expect a huge blow to consumer spending and widespread hardship. Finally, Congress and the White House should work to control the virus and enact substantial, sustained, and structural policies that ensure widely shared prosperity. So for example, we've got in the HEROES Act a number of policies, such as the $600 benefit being extended, as well as a new round of recovery rebates that are more inclusive. And additional policies that should be considered include an automatic stabilizer policy so that we don't have to keep fighting for every round of unemployment insurance benefits, and other approaches such as a new job seekers allowance that could help workers who are otherwise left out of these benefits. Thank you, and I look forward to taking questions.
Well, thank you. And it's, I appreciate your testimony, and it's very good information. Let me see, we have so far Representative Wild and Sablon. Representative Wild.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Sir, I want to talk a little bit about Social Security. There's been some confusion regarding the executive order relating to the payroll tax. The text of the order seems to defer payroll taxes, making them due at a later date, but the president's statements have suggested that he plans to terminate the tax altogether, which I think we all know would leave Social Security hanging in the balance for our seniors. We know that with a recession with a very high unemployment rate, as we are in right now, already threatens Social Security solvency. And even before COVID, the fact that every dollar that high earners make above $137,000 per year is not subject to payroll tax, which has already threatened Social Security solvency. So my question to you is this. First of all, do we have any idea or projections about what percentage of workers or businesses will be able to pay in full once the deferral period ends? And I'll go ahead and ask my second question. You can weave them together if you like. And is there a risk that if the economy takes another bad turn, which doesn't require further elaboration, that the deferral will actually have the same effect as a permanent cut to Social Security?
I'm happy to take those questions, and I really appreciate them, Representative Wild. I think first, I'm not aware of any such projections, but I will say this. The proposal is not something anyone asked for, even employers, and it's quite complicated, just like the unemployment executive order. And it's very likely that many employers will not choose to comply. At the end of the day, as you implied, employers are on the hook for making sure that the payments are made. So simply deferring collection of the Social Security payroll tax would create a huge administrative burden. I mean, just think about what would happen if a worker separated from employment during the next few months after this tax was withheld. Employers typically don't have a way of even tracking and re-engaging former employees to correct that. The real threat in many ways, while there is certainly a threat right now, as far as the trust funds, not just because of the pandemic and recession, but this executive order, the Social Security Trust Fund, of course, wouldn't be collecting as much interest if the payments are deferred, but one could make it whole, as the Obama administration did in a prior related agreement. But the real threat is, of course, as you pointed out, that the president has indicated that he would, if reelected, eliminate the payroll tax for Social Security, which has arguably protected it just as FDR suggested it would. It helps people know and understand and feel that this is an earned benefit that they've contributed to. And if anything, this pandemic and recession should underscore the value of its structure and the benefits that it provides.
Thank you for that. I also wanted to ask you, and this is not related to that issue, but the one thing I will say on the Social Security issue is I'm concerned that with a deferral, for however long it happens, that the next thing we would be facing would be lobbying by the business community to forgive those payroll taxes that had been deferred. And also, am I correct that individuals who may or may not be employed by the time the deferral period is up would actually find themselves faced with a large bill that they hadn't been budgeting for?
I think that's exactly right, Representative Wild. There will, in many ways, these executive orders should be seen in the political terms that they are. I think written as the way that they're intended. And here, what you're getting at is that, similarly with unemployment benefits, where maybe one day someone will bring a lawsuit, have standing, and strike down the unlawful benefits that the White House and administration are authorizing, but there would probably be congressional pressure to sort of make whole states. So I think that's an absolutely valid concern. And I think that, in general, what we know for a fact is that workers and their employers are legally liable for those payroll contributions under the Federal Insurance Contributions Act. So any deferral has to, at some point, come to terms with that.
Thank you very much. I have a lot of questions I'd love to ask you, but my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We have Mr. Sablan, Takano, and Norcross. Sablan.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Thank you for our two guests as well. Mr. Miller, the American Council on Education, ACE, estimates that students will need at least $46.6 billion to address the challenges and disruptions created by COVID-19 alone, and an additional maybe $74 billion to cover just the cost of resuming in-person and hybrid instruction in the fall. While the $14 billion provided in the CARES Act was an essential first part, much more is needed to adequately support institutions and students. So, Mr. Miller, what do you see, what do you predict will happen if Congress does not provide additional funding to stabilize institutions of higher education, and what will this impact on students be? Please.
Thank you. I think the unfortunate truth is it will be nothing short of a disaster. We have seen exactly what happened when there wasn't enough money provided in the last recession, which is that we saw massive cuts by states to their public higher education systems, which then turned right away into fairly steep price hikes for students and an explosion in student loan debt that we're still dealing with the ramifications of. And beyond just sort of the effects on students in the price there, I also worry a lot about what it means in terms of quality and capacity. $1 in cuts that doesn't get fully passed on to students means that money's coming from somewhere. And so that could mean things like cutting back services, like laying off tenured faculty and trying to switch to adjuncts, getting rid of whole programs and departments, as we're already seeing some colleges do, restricting capacity in courses. And the real challenge we've seen is when those types of things happen, not only does it harm the education that students are now paying more money for, but it also creates an opportunity for predatory actors to come in. We saw in the last recession that a lot of low quality schools were able to come in and recruit a lot of students simply because we didn't do enough to fund the public sector to serve all the ones who were coming in. And that too has had very major ramifications. We're still trying to forgive loans for students who were essentially suckered into some of those colleges years and years later. And the other thing I would just say about that very quickly is just that we've seen that when all these things happen, the hardest hit really are our lowest income students, our students of color, and in particular our Black students, just when you look at the numbers on debt and things like that. And so I worry a lot about what it's going to mean for the individuals we most want to be obtaining a college education in this country.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Mr. Chairman, Ms. Davis has been raising her hand, and so I yield as chair of higher education, I yield my 2 minutes plus something to the chairwoman, Susan Davis.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Actually, Ben, you just addressed a little bit of the secondary effects here. And that really is my question, and how we get at that, because part of it is anticipating worst case scenarios. But I think those are the things that matter to people. We have so many students now who are trying to decide between whether they should continue with their education or they should take this unintended break.
Right.
and what the effects of that are going to be, whether or not they're able to, even if they get a little bit of help through, the Trump plan, what are those secondary effects? And if they are not able to take advantage of any of that, does that mean that they would be considered off the rolls, essentially, and they may not be able to come back? What do we know about that, and how can we communicate that?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing that I am most worried about here, which is that we really don't know what the effects of enrollment look like yet. We've seen very little data out of what happened in the spring in terms of who stopped out and who didn't come back. And we unfortunately probably aren't going to know much more until a couple of weeks from now when school really starts about who's really going to show up. We've seen that FAFSA applications have fallen somewhat, especially, and that would suggest that it's particularly going to hit lower income individuals. The Department of Education, unfortunately, does not collect any race data on that, so we can't see who it is that's not filling out the FAFSA. And the same thing is just because someone puts down a deposit or fills out a FAFSA doesn't mean they show up, and we don't know who those folks are right now. And I think that that's a real concern because we already have more people in this country who have tried college and not finished than we do people who never finished high school. And our sort of crisis of adult non-completion was massive before this crisis began. And I am just very worried that if we don't do more to ensure that those folks can stay in college, that we're going to be facing real problems. And I think that means not just covering the direct tuition costs, finding ways to help them there, but clearly issues like rent and housing. And we're hearing heartbreaking stories about students trying to work by basically driving to their college and sitting in the car because they don't have internet access at home. And it's clear that the scope of need we need to be considering here if we want to try and keep people enrolled, keep them going, is much greater than just thinking about tuition.
Thank you. And thank you, Keely, for doing that. Thanks.
Thank you. We have Takano Norcross. Mr. Takano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Miller, my first question is about the funding for FEMA. I understand that the President's executive order intends to fund the $400 reduced amount of unemployment supplemental per week through unspent money through FEMA. Was that money that was originally allocated to FEMA not only to embrace funding disasters, but also the cost of the pandemic?
I think I'm going to let my co-panelist talk about that because he's more of the expert on the unemployment insurance side of things.
Okay, very good.
Yep. I appreciate that. Thanks, Ben and Representative Takano. Yeah, so that money is there to match state spending in the case of more crises, disasters, extreme weather type events. So one of the things that the administration had to do is to say, look, it's 44 billion, but we're going to stop payments if the 44 billion falls down to 25 billion. Because, as Chairman Scott pointed out, I mean, we're hitting hurricane season. We've historically never really adequately funded preparation for and responses to these crises. So yes, this is a zero-sum game. The president has not offered through his executive order here a single new dollar.
Yeah, but this unspent FEMA money, it's the same pot of money that we're spending on hurricane relief as we are using to reimburse local communities for emergency housing because of the COVID-19, right? It's the same pot of money.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
The unspent sum, and so he's spending against. He's redirecting money away from disaster relief and also COVID-19 response to help those communities. Because I know we have Peter DeFazio has a provision to relieve the states of that 25% burden so that they can address the emergency concerns related to COVID-19. I want to go back to maybe Mr. Miller on you mentioned about the for-profit colleges taking advantages of moments like this. It strikes me that our community colleges in particular are a sector that we should be strategizing to bolster during a moment like this, not just now, but 2 or 3 years from now. And it's a sector that not only young people will need to use, but people of all ages as they attempt to retool for the economy. So the current situation puts our community colleges in grave danger of tremendous defunding. Meanwhile, are for-profit schools in the same sort of danger? I mean, aren't they able just to recruit young people, students based on their ability to qualify for federal loans and Pell Grants and that sort of thing?
That's correct. I mean, essentially the entire for-profit model is predicated upon a very aggressive recruitment practice and essentially receiving almost all of their money from federal financial aid, whether that be loans or grants. And we're already seeing there are some for-profits, especially the ones that operate entirely online, that are already trumpeting massive enrollment growth and very, very good numbers, to the point where you even actually had one chain turn down the CARES money because it was doing so well, it wanted to pay out a dividend to its shareholders, and it couldn't do that by taking the CARES funds. And so, I'm very worried that if we don't adequately fund our community colleges here, we're just going to see the same thing we saw after the Great Recession, which was community colleges saw a huge influx of students because they are the on-ramp to education for people seeking multiple different pathways, whether that's a short-term certificate or an associate degree or a path to a bachelor's degree or something like that. And when they don't have the funding and the money, then people go elsewhere. And I think—
Is it not perverse that we are in danger of starving our community colleges of money, but yet we are permitting for-profit schools to flourish in this moment? Ought we not to make it a priority to also put a check on for-profit schools in the Relief Act to take out that loophole, the 90-10 rule?
Yes, I certainly think so. I mean, I found it very odd that the CARES Act decided to provide direct institutional support to private for-profit colleges. I mean, the whole way they try to sell themselves is that they're based upon the private market, and that's why people go to them. But if they're just getting direct government financing, that should be counting toward 90-10, and we should not be doing that. Especially because one of the things that I'm really worried about is, community colleges serve about 44% of students, and they only got about 27% of the money in the CARES Act. And that's real underinvestment and really worrisome when you think about the hits they may be taking in their budgets going forward.
Well, my time is up, Mr. Chairman, but I applaud the committee's work in terms of the way in which we attempted to bolster community colleges in our bill and CARES. But I do think we have to go a step further. We need to insert into that section, into the next relief bill, a 90-10 loophole closure. It just positions community colleges versus private for-profit schools in a very poor manner and a perverse manner.
Okay, and we're also considering a question of whether the distribution should be per capita or full-time equivalent, which would, if it's per capita, would significantly help the community colleges.
Mr. Chairman, that's what I was referring to. I specifically want to praise the work of the committee and your work on standing behind the per capita formulation.
Thank you. We have Norcross and Adams. Mr. Norcross.
Thank you, Chairman. Appreciate you holding this hearing, and because I call it the reality hearing, what's actually going on out there. My first question is for Mr. Dudagupa. New Jersey has been struggling, as I am guessing many other states, with the lack of the $600 additional that was running since this pandemic started. And they're challenged by a set of rules that have to be changed. Are you seeing anywhere in the rest of the United States a state come up with a set of rules that is engaging what the president has put out?
Representative Norcross, I think that there are states, at least at the political level, who are indicating that they're going to try to find a way to take advantage of the set aside of, what are really dollars intended for disaster relief. But one of the states, for example, Ohio, that has indicated that it would get the payments up and running in a couple of weeks was among the very last, if not the last state to get a pandemic unemployment assistance program up after the CARES Act established it. So, I'm skeptical. I think what you'll see is that states will feel some pressure, but some may correctly say, look, there's not that much money there. This thing could be considered illegal, and we really need Congress to negotiate. And what you will see for those states that can find a way to get the program working and comply with the constantly shifting requirements is probably a one check after several weeks that sort of adds up the payments that were due for the weeks beginning August 1. So right now it's not clear. A lot of talk.
So what we're seeing is there is no embracement like, wow, we're going to take a hold of this and run with it. It was a talking point is unfortunately what we're seeing, and using workers who are unemployed as pawns in this. Thank you for the answer. Mr. Miller, New Jersey, we have over 600 school districts, tens of thousands of actual buildings. Our state has asked for each district to present a plan on how they're going to open under pandemic without any standards. There is the CDC, the recommendations. Bobby Scott has been leading the effort to create these standards. So we're not all creating our own little silo of what we think we should do. That continues to be a problem because as we try to review 600 different plans, we have 600 different opinions, quite frankly. There are some common areas, obviously. Creating standards. Virginia just did theirs across the board because of what they have in relation to OSHA. New Jersey has the ability to set standards for public employees, but not the private area. Tell me, in your experience, what you're seeing that creating your own standards, i.e. 600 districts versus a single standard that we all can be measured by and all aspire to. What do you see the challenges of set your own standard versus a standard across the state?
Yeah, so I will admit I spend most of my time on the higher education side of things, so I've been looking more there than on the school district side, but it's pretty clear that an approach that results in every single place creating its own plan, while it does recognize the fact that some places may have different levels of the virus and be in different levels of hotspots than others, ultimately creates a ton of confusion. I mean, we're seeing in the college level, we're seeing some plan to go remote, whereas a place down the street may want to go in person. We're seeing some basically become heavy purchasers of plexiglass, while others want to do a hybrid model or only bring back those who are sort of in programs like nursing, where you need to have some in-person component. And I think it's just very, very messy. And it's just a testament to really how little leadership we're getting from the Department of Education here, as well as the federal government. I mean, you think about times of crisis, like say during the Recovery Act in 2009, where you really had the administration leading and trying to help provide guidance and funding to schools and states about what to do to cope with what they were facing. And that's just not happening here. And in fact, actually the efforts to really push on reopening with no plan seems to be backfiring, making things worse and more confusing.
I'd like to thank the panelists for their answers, and certainly Chairman Scott for holding this. I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our guests for being here today. The CARES Act suspended wage garnishment and other involuntary collections for borrowers in default, providing a necessary reprieve to some of our most vulnerable student loan borrowers. However, 5 months now after the CARES Act was passed, the Education Department still has not fully complied with the law. And there are still more than 2,000 student loan borrowers whose wages are being illegally garnished. So, Mr. Miller, what do you know, what do we know about borrowers subject to involuntary collections? And does the President's executive action provide a continued suspension of wage garnishments and other involuntary collections?
Thank you, Representative Adams. Unfortunately, the order is completely silent on this issue of collections and wage garnishment, which is deeply troubling. In terms of what we know about these borrowers, I mean, an individual ends up in default and is subject to garnishment is much more likely to be lower income than other students in college. They're less likely to have finished because a lot of these individuals took out a loan hoping to better themselves and oftentimes were let down by the system, weren't able to finish, and now struggle to pay it back. We in particular also see that Black student loan borrowers are much more likely to end up in default than others. And so I worry a great deal about the equity impacts of continuing any sort of activity that does not continue to pause debt collection during this time, because we're going to end up taking money directly from some of our most vulnerable borrowers who really need those funds in their pockets right now. And it's also, I think the fact that the administration after 5 months is still trying to garnish some of these individuals really suggests that it is not capable of pivoting on a dime, and that having it start this up again is a bad idea, because it needs to get it right what they were supposed to do in CARES before it does anything else now.
Okay. Mr. Miller, it's clear that institutions are facing severe financial constraints as a result of the pandemic. Given the primary source of revenue is through tuition dollars, a lot of our schools, particularly our HBCUs, I'm concerned about drops in enrollment. I'm also concerned about the likely losses from on-campus programming, medical centers, health systems, not to mention the deep cuts in state and local funding for public institutions. So what is the outlook on institutional financial stability right now? And how will these shortfalls impact the institution's ability to operate effectively and provide a quality education for their students?
I mean, unfortunately, the outlook right now is very negative. You know, colleges already took massive hits before we've even gotten to the fall in terms of having to close dorms or refund some tuition or room and board money, operate reduced capacity. You also referenced, for those that have medical centers, you know, they're not performing as many procedures and things like that. And so before we've even gotten to state cuts or what's happening in the fall, a lot of places are already hurting. And I worry a great deal that if we don't see additional federal money coming into these institutions, especially the increased funding for HBCUs and other minority serving institutions that we saw from the HEROES Act, that we're going to be looking at a lot of places that their very financial viability is going to be threatened. And they're either going to be faced with awful choices like reducing programming. We're already seeing some places close some departments or lay off some faculty, or they're going to have to raise prices. And we already know that there's a lot of students out there that are struggling to afford the tuition prices where they are, and raising them further is going to put them deeper in debt and put them in a tougher spot. It's just very clear at this point, we can't balance our way out of the crisis between either cutting the colleges or making the students pay more. We have to help them with additional federal support.
Thank you. Mr. Duda, members of this committee are familiar with the long and painful history of racist exclusion in labor laws like the Federal Labor Standards Act that cut workers of color out of minimum wage, overtime, and other critical protections. So what is the parallel history of racist exclusion in our unemployment insurance system, and in what ways does that history continue to be evident today?
Thank you, Representative Adams, for that question. I mean, briefly, one, you've still got the workers who are most excluded tend to be workers of color, especially Black workers, but in some cases now also Latinx workers. Secondly, I would just say we have a federal-state partnership here, and the states that have the stingiest programs are those with the largest Black population shares, and that's not a coincidence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Let me ask a follow-up question on that. Does executive order include the self-employed gig workers and independent contractors?
Representative Scott, the most recent guidance from the administration suggests that if a state can come up with its required match that to cover those who get federal benefits under pandemic unemployment assistance, or the pandemic emergency unemployment compensation, which is the extra 13 weeks, that then yes, they can be included. Analyses from the Century Foundation and the Center on Budget Policy Priorities that haven't been published yet suggest that a few states may actually struggle to come up with that match, and in which case they could choose to not participate or exclude those workers.
Thank you. Anyone else have questions? Let me ask a couple of questions then. Mr. Miller, you mentioned cuts in state and local governments and effect on education. Can you, we've seen estimates as much as, well, as low as $200 billion cuts to education. probably closer to, when you get state and local combined, closer to 300 billion or more. Can you quantify what you anticipate those cuts to be if there's no support for state and local governments in COVID relief bills?
Yeah, so we don't have complete numbers on how much the cuts are going to be yet, but those numbers is about what we've been anticipating in terms of what the additional need looks like. So we think that we need probably about $50 billion to essentially save our childcare system, because other individuals here at CAP have projected that we'll lose half of our national capacity in our childcare centers if we don't invest more money there. We think we need about $200 billion for K-12 systems, and then at least 50 just for the public side of higher education. So I think when you factor in private minority serving institutions as well as other private colleges, you're also adding additional money there. And so
But when you said 200 billion for K through 12, is that in addition to support for state and local, or to offset state and local?
So it gets a little bit tricky here, because our expectation would be that if there is state and local funding, we would see a pass through of some substantial amount of that to education, because we know that education is one of the few core areas that state budgets typically go to. So we had been thinking about what we need to deliver to education, but I'd say in terms of an overall number, where HEROES landed in terms of roughly the $1 trillion for state and local is what we need to deliver. And then the way it would be split out would probably vary somewhat by state, but that the hope would be that we would see some portion of that be going with a specific earmark to education. Because
Well, one of the reasons you can't discuss a bill in silos is you can't discuss the education portion of the budget without knowing whether you've got state and local covered. If we've got state and local covered, based on what we just said, the cuts to education of $200 to $300 billion won't take place. So the $100 billion is a step forward. If you have nothing for state and local, and the $200 to $300 billion cuts go forward, $100 billion won't even cover a third to a half of the anticipated cuts. And we know that it's going to cost more to open the schools. The ventilation systems is just one high price, high ticket item that we cover in a separate bill, the moving forward infrastructure bill, where there's 130 billion for school construction to take care of the ventilation systems. How are schools, if we don't do state and local, how are schools going to possibly be able to spend more to be able to open safely if we haven't even covered the anticipated cuts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just very afraid that we're not going to spend enough. And you're completely correct, Chairman Scott. We need to spend on both the state and local side and on the education side, because if we only spend on the education side, as we've seen some bills propose, states will probably cut that same amount of money, if not a lot more, because we need to basically shore up both sides of the budgets, because not only are they facing cuts, but also, as you referenced, it's going to cost a lot more money to operate. You know, some of the testing regimes that we've seen some colleges propose are going to run, you know, close to $1 million. And there's probably not many community colleges that could establish anything close to that if we want them to be able to test and trace, to be able to get the necessary PPE, even to operate at a reduced capacity, just bringing back core programs and things like that. And so I think a approach that really tackles all of the issues in terms of the state and local side and the education side is absolutely crucial here.
Thank you. Mr. Dutta-Gupta, there's been a lot of complaints about the $600 preventing job openings from being filled. I understand that there may be some studies that specifically spoke to that. Can you say a word about how many jobs are not being filled because we are supplementing the unemployment compensation?
Representative Scott, there have been 5 different studies using at least 4 different data sets, 5 completely different methodologies and approaches. Researchers from inside government, the private sector, nobody can find any evidence of any negative effect on employment. And that would make sense, because partly what they find is that instead of having, you know, hundreds of people apply for each opening, you may have, you know, only 100. So that critique just doesn't hold water amidst a contagious disease pandemic like what we're facing.
Thank you. And I see my time has expired. Did anyone else have any questions? If not, We want to thank our witnesses for being with us today. This has been very helpful. Let me ask one other question. I guess it's to
Mr.
Mr.
Scott,
Duda. Okay, Mr. Duda, when you talk about garnishing people on student loans, I don't know whether this is who would either been. If you talk about garnishing people on student loans, would that include not just wages, but also checking accounts?
So we can garnish wages. We can, I'm sorry, not we, but the federal government will garnish wages. It will also seize things like tax refunds. So we saw that because CARES went into place in mid-March, there actually were some tax refunds seized because a lot of times people who are most in need of the help from things like the earned income tax credit tend to be very early filers. So they may have already lost their tax refunds and they can't get it back. And those who got theirs taken are still hoping. Also, the other thing that would go back into place would be Social Security garnishment, which does happen to a larger number of borrowers than you might think. And, you know, again, you're taking the funds right from people who we really don't want to. For those who aren't getting a tax refund.
I know the IRS will garnish checking accounts.
So they won't garnish they'll garnish the wages. They won't go right into the checking account, but obviously they will keep charging them both collection fees and interest. So their balance will keep growing and it will really wreck their credit. So we are incredibly punitive to defaulted student loan borrowers, possibly more so than any other form of debt, because we charge both interest and collection fees. There's no statute of limitations. They can go after you forever, as we can see, because they're taking Social Security as well.
Thank you. Mr. Scano, do you have a follow-up?
I do have a follow-up, Mr. Scott. I think it would be well to sort out a little further our witnesses' knowledge about how the state and local funding works with the earmarked money that we have for higher ed. So, Mr. Scott, you pointed out that we've got relief in the HEROES Act for state governments and local governments. Mr. Miller, community colleges are often, at least in my state and many parts of the country, I know in Texas, they're organized by local districts, much like school districts. They're not funded by states. So can you help us understand how community colleges would benefit from the HEROES Act in terms of, I know that about 10% of our state budget might go to our community colleges. Another X percent goes to the University of California. But then do they also get direct relief through the local government portion of the HEROES Act?
So I'm not sure in terms of exactly where the local money would flow, but you are correct that for a lot of community colleges in several states, local funding is a key part of their revenue. It does vary somewhat. Some states it's more than the state money. Some states it's less. It is a little variable across the country, but it is a big deal. I mean, nationally, we're looking at about 70% of the revenue for community colleges comes from state or local. And I think it's roughly a 50-50 split with, again, it being higher in some states versus others. So if you don't help on the local revenue side, then you're going to be facing a real challenge for community colleges, especially because one of the things we've seen historically in the past is that local revenue tends to be a little bit more stable than state revenue, because local revenue is coming from things like property taxes that tend to not jump around quite as much as state cuts. And so for a lot of these states, if their local revenue doesn't get either restored, or if they don't get help from the local revenue pot, they're going to be facing pretty severe challenges because they can't increase their tuition to make up the difference. And for them, the local pot, especially in certain states, is actually a larger share than tuition or the state funding. And
Mr. Miller, if I may, Mr. Scott, I recall from the last great the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, that many people, that one of the consequences in terms of Social Security garnishment, people who are having their Social Security garnished, were a lot of people that took out student loans. That student loans account for a significant share of those Social Security garnishments, because those loans are undischargeable and they follow you all the way through your life. You know, some people actually use those loans to get by because you can use those loans to pay for more than schooling. And so people were taking out loans for that purpose too.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that we have to cover more than just the direct education costs if we expect anyone to succeed in higher education, because if you can't put food on the table, if you can't pay your rent, it's completely unrealistic to expect you to succeed in your academic affairs. And I think the challenge we're seeing here is that, you know, the way we've constructed our support for higher education and as part of the broader safety net is we've made student loans available, but have not been able to keep up nearly as much on the grant aid side, or apart from when we had the increase in unemployment insurance, things like that, it's just not nearly as generous. And so we've forced people to basically say, if you want to have better ways to support yourself, we'll make college an option, but instead of supporting you with robust grant aid, we're going to make you look at the loan side. And for too many borrowers, that's shifting essentially all of the risk of trying college directly onto the borrower rather than holding it on the government side. And when it doesn't work out, the consequences are dire. You know, we should absolutely not be taking Social Security from our seniors to pay for a student loan that's in default. I mean, it's just, we should not be doing it.
But it happens at a significant amount that Social Security garnishments are related to student loan default, student loan debt. That's followed.
That's correct. I forget the exact number off the top of my head. I'm happy to follow up with you afterward. I know that the GAO did a study looking at this, and I just can't remember if it was 680,000 or something like that, or 68,000. But it's at least tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of borrowers. I mean, it is a lot of people we're talking about here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for indulging me. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony. This has been very helpful. We wanted to kind of flesh out the details of the difference between the press releases and reality. In terms of student loans, we found that the executive order only goes a couple of months and does not protect the students from garnishments. And the unemployment insurance, states are going to have trouble complying if they can. It uses FEMA money, which can run out any day now. So it'll only last a short period of time, in stark contrast to the HEROES Act, which is comprehensive, goes well into next year, and really protects the students and the workers. And so I thank our witnesses for being with us today. Thank the members for participating. And if there's nothing more, this concludes the briefing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.